Page 237, Chapter 6, That Spring. Through the windows of the Buterki prison early morning and evening in June 1945, we could hear the brassy notes of bands not far away, coming from either Lesnaya Street or Svazlo-Butskaya. They kept playing marches over and over. Behind the murky green muzzles of reinforced glass, we stood at the wide-open but impenetrable prison windows and listened. Were they military units that were marching, or were they workers, cheerfully devoting their free time to marching practice? We didn't know, but the rumor had already gotten through to us. The preparations were underway for a big victory parade on Red Square on June 22nd, the 4th anniversary of the beginning of the war. The foundation stones of a great building are destined to groan and be pressed upon. It is not for them to crown the edifice, but even the honor of being part of the foundation was denied those whose doomed heads and ribs had borne the first blows of this war and thwarted the foreigners' victory, and who were now abandoned for no good reason. Joyful sounds mean naught to the traitor. That spring of 1945 was, in our prisons, predominantly the spring of the Russian prisoners of war. They passed through the prisons of the Soviet Union in vast, dense gray shoals like ocean herring. The first trace of those schools I glimpsed was Uri, but I was soon entirely surrounded by their purposeful motion, which seemed to know its own fated design. Not only war prisoners passed through those cells. A wave of those who had spent any time in Europe was rolling to emigres from the Civil War, the Ostalski workers recruited as laborers by the Germans during World War II, Red Army officers who had been too astute and far-sighted in their conclusions, so that Stalin feared they might bring European freedom back from their European crusade, like the Decembrists 120 years before. And yet it was the war prisoners who constituted the bulk of the wave. And among the war prisoners of various ages most were of my own age, not precisely my age, but the twins of October, those born along with the revolution who, in 1937, had poured forth undismayed to celebrate the 20th century of the revolution, and whose age group at the beginning of the war made up the standing army, which had been scattered in a matter of weeks. That tedious prison spring had, to the tune of the victory marches, become the spring of reckoning for my whole generation. Over our cradles the rallying cry had resounded, all power to the Soviets. It was we who had reached out our suntan, childish hands to clutch the pioneer's bugle, and who, in response to the pioneer challenge, "Be prepared," had saluted and answered, "We are always prepared." It was we who had smuggled weapons into Buchenwald and joined the Communist Party there, and it was we who were now in disgrace only because we had survived. Back when the Red Army had cut through East Prussia, I had seen downcast columns of returning war prisoners, the only people around who were grieving instead of celebrating. Even then their gloom had shocked me, though I didn't yet grasp the reason for it. I jumped down and went over to those voluntarily formed up columns. Why were they marching in columns? Why had they lined themselves up in ranks? After all, no one had compelled them to, and the war prisoners of all other nations went home as scattered individuals, but ours wanted to return as submissively as possible. I was wearing a captain's shoulder boards, and plus the fact that I was moving forward, helped prevent my finding out why our POWs were so sad. But then fate turned me around and sent me in the wake of those prisoners along the same path they had taken. I had already marched with them from Army counterintelligence headquarters to the headquarters at the front. And when they got there, I had heard their first stories, which I didn't yet understand. And then Yuri Y told me the whole thing. And here beneath the domes of the red brick Butirki castle, I felt that the story of these several million Russian prisoners had got me in its grip once and for all, like a pin through a specimen beetle. My own story of landing in prison seemed insignificant. I stopped regretting my torn-off shoulder boards. It was mere chance that had kept me from ending up exactly where these contemporaries of mine had ended. I came to understand that it was my duty to take upon my shoulders a share of their common burden, and to bear it to the last man until it crushed us. I now felt as if I too had fallen prisoner at the Soloviev crossing, in the Kharkov encirclement, in the quarries of Kerch, and, hands behind my back, had carried my Soviet pride behind the barbed wire of the concentration camps. But I too had stood for hours in the freezing cold for a ladle of cold kawa, a type of coffee, and had been left on the ground for dead, without even reaching the kettle, that in Oplag 68, Swalki, I had used my hands and the lid of a meth tin to dig a bell-shaped foxhole, so as not to have to spend the winter in the open field, and that a maddened prisoner had crawled up to me as I lay dying to gnaw on the still warm flesh beneath my arm. And with every new day of exacerbated, famished consciousness, lying in a barracks riddled with typhus, or at the barbed wire of the neighboring camp for English POWs, the clear thought that had penetrated my dying brain: Soviet Russia has renounced her dying children. She needed them, proud sons of Russia, as long as they let the tanks roll over them, and it was still possible to rouse them to attack. But to feed them, as it was still possible to feed them once they were war prisoners, extra mouths and extra witnesses to humiliating defeats. Sometimes we try to lie, but our tongue will not allow us to. These people were labeled traitors, but a remarkable slip of the tongue occurred on the part of the judges, prosecutors, and interrogators, and the convicted prisoners. The entire nation and the newspapers repeated and reinforced this mistake, involuntarily letting the truth out of the bag. They intended to declare them traitors to the motherland, but they were universally referred to in speech and in writing, even in the court documents, as traitors of the motherland. You said it. They're not traitors to her. They were her traitors. It was not they, the unfortunates, who had betrayed the motherland, but their calculating motherland who had betrayed them, not just once, but thrice. The first time she betrayed them was on the battlefield through ineptitude, when the government, so beloved by the motherland, did everything it could to lose the war, destroyed the lines of fortifications, set up a whole air force for annihilation, dismantled the tanks and artillery, removed defective generals, and forbade armies to resist. And the war prisoners were the men whose bodies took the blow and stopped the Wehrmacht. The second time they were heartlessly betrayed by the motherland was when she abandoned them to die in captivity. And the third time they were unscrupulously betrayed was when, with motherly love, she coaxed them to return home with such phrases as, "The motherland has forgiven you, the motherland calls you," and snared them the moment they reached the frontiers. It would appear that during the 1,100 years of Russia's existence as a state, there have been how many foul and terrible deeds, but among them there was never so multi-million foul deed as this, to betray one's own soldiers and proclaim them as traitors. How easily we left them out of our own accounting. He was a traitor, for shame. Write him off. And our father wrote them off even before we did. He threw the flower of Moscow's intelligentsia into the Piazza meat grinder with Verdun single-loading rifles, vintage 1866, and only one for every 5 men at that. But Lev Tolstoy is going to describe that Bortino for us, and with one stupid slither of his greasy, stubby finger, the great strategist sent 120,000 of our young men, almost as many as all the Russian forces at Borodino, across the Strait of Kerch in December 1941, senselessly and exclusively for the sake of sensational New Year's communique. He turned them all over to the Germans without a fight. And yet, for some reason, it was not he who was the traitor, but they. How easily we let ourselves be taken in by partisan labels. How easily we agreed to regard these devoted men as traitors. In one of the Peterki cells that spring, there was an old man, Lebedev, a metallurgist, a professor in rank and in appearance, a stalwart artisan of the last century, or maybe even the century before, from, say, famous Demidov iron foundries. He was broad of shoulder, broad of head, wore a Progess-like beard, and the wide span of its hand could lift a 150-pound bucket. In the cell he wore a faded grey labourer's smock, and over his underwear he was slovenly and might have been an auxiliary prison worker until he sat down to read, and then his habitual, powerful intelligence lit up his face. The men often gathered around him. He discussed metallurgy very little, but explained to us in his kettle-drum bass voice that Stalin was exactly the same kind of dog as Ivan the Terrible. Shoot, strangle, don't hesitate. He explained to us also that Maxim Gorky had been a slobbering prattler, an apologist for executioners. I was very much taken with this Lebedev. It was as though the whole Russian people were embodied there before my eyes, in that one thick-set torso with that intelligent head and arms and legs of a plowman. He had already thought through so much. I learned from him to understand the world, and suddenly, with a chopping gesture of his huge hand, he thundered out that those charged under Article 58, 1b, were traitors of the motherland, and must not be forgiven. And those very same 1bs were piled up on the board bunks all around. And how hurtful to them this was. The old man was pontificating with such conviction in the name of Russian peasantry and labor that they were abashed and found it hard to defend themselves against the attack from this new direction. I was the one to whom it fell, along with the two boys charged under 5810, to defend them and to argue with the old man. But what depths of enforced ignorance were achieved by the monstrous lies of the state. Even the most broad-minded of us can embrace only that part of the truth into which our own snout has blundered. How many wars Russia has been involved in. It would have been better if there had been fewer. And were there many traitors in all those wars? Had anyone observed that treason that had deeply rooted in the hearts of Russian soldiers, then under the most just social system in the world came most just war of all, and out of nowhere millions of traitors appeared from among the simplest and slowest elements of the population. How is it to be understood and explained? Capitalist England fought at her side against Hitler. Marx had eloquently described the poverty and suffering of the working class in that same England. Why was it that in this war only one traitor could be found among them, a businessman? Lord, haha. But in our country, millions? It is frightening to open one's trap about this, but might the heart of the matter not be in the political system? One of our most ancient proverbs justifies the war prisoner. The captive will cry out, but the dead man never. During the reign of Tsar Alexei Mikhailovich, nobility was granted for durance in captivity. And in all subsequent wars, it was considered society's duty to exchange prisoners, to comfort one's own, and to give them sustenance and aid. Every escape from captivity was glorified as a height of heroism. Throughout World.War.1, money was collected in Russia to aid our prisoners of war, and our nurses were permitted to go to Germany and help our prisoners. And our newspapers reminded their readers daily that our prisoners of war, our compatriots, were languishing in equal captivity. All the Western peoples behaved the same in our war. Parcels, letters, and all kinds of assistance flowed freely through the neutral countries. Western POWs did not have to lower themselves to accept ladlefuls from German soup kettles. They talked back to the German guards. Western governments gave their captured soldiers their seniority rights, their regular promotions, and their pay. The only soldier in the world who cannot surrender is a soldier of the world's one and only Red Army. That's what it says in our military statutes. The Germans would shout at us from their trenches, Ivan Plekny, Ivan no prisoner. Who can picture all that means? There is war, there is death, but there is no surrender. What a discovery. What it means is, go and die, we will go on living, and if you lose your legs, yet manage to return from captivity on crutches, we will convict you. The Leningrader Ivanov, commander of a machine gun platoon in the Finnish War, was subsequently thus imprisoned in Gulag, for example. Our soldiers, alone renounced by their motherland and degraded to nothing in the eyes of enemies and allies, had to push their way to the swill being doled out in the backyards of the Third Reich. Our soldiers alone had the doors shut tight to keep them from returning to their homes. Although their young souls tried hard not to believe this, there was something called Article 58 1b, and in wartime it provided only for execution by shooting. For not wanting to die from a German bullet, the prisoner had to die from a Soviet bullet. For having been a prisoner of war, some get theirs from the enemy and we get ours from our own. Incidentally, it is very naive to say what for, and no time have governments been moralists. They never imprisoned people and executed them to keep them from doing something. They imprisoned all those POWs, of course, not for treason to the motherland, because it was absolutely clear to even a fool that only the Vlasov men could be accused of treason. They imprisoned all of them to keep them from telling their fellow villagers about Europe. What the eye doesn't see, the heart doesn't grieve. Wait, then, were the courses of action open to Russian war prisoners? What then were the courses of action open to Russian war prisoners? There was only one legally acceptable course: to lie down and let oneself be trampled to death. Every blade of grass pushes its fragile length upward in order to live. As for you, lie down and be trampled on. Even though you've been slow about it, Even though you couldn't do it on the battlefield, at least die now, then you will not be prosecuted. The soldiers sleep, they spoke their word, and they are right for eternity. And every other path which, in desperation, your mind may invent is going to lead you into conflict with the law. Escape and return to the motherland, past the guards bringing the camp, across half Germany, then through Poland or the Balkans, led straight to Smyrna prison. They were asked, "How did you manage to escape when others couldn't? This stinks. Come on, you're a rat. What assignment did they give you?" Mikhail Bernatsev, Pavel Bondarenko, and many others. And it's a really sad chapter of the POWs, how they were treated. I remember this was one of the sad things that stuck with me all these years after I read it first. Thank you for listening. Talk to you later. Good night.